The law is not a series of calculating machines where definitions and answers come tumbling out when the right levers are pushed. William O. Douglas, American jurist. All right. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time this evening. Normally, I would be saying this early. What's going on here? Why are we streaming off schedule, DL? Well, as it turns out, I am just shy of my requirements on Rumble to make sure that I can stay in the Rumble Creator Program. So last minute, I had to do what I got to do. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes it's crunch time and you just make stuff happen. And that's what I'm doing. I'm making stuff happen. Tomorrow we'll get back at it. It'll be the first and we can just kick right into it. By the way, tomorrow starts the new requirement, because I was doing so well with the old ones. They're starting a new requirement tomorrow. That is, I have to have 20 chatters in the live stream, and I believe it only comes from Rumble. So 20 chatters throughout the month. So like if you come in, like say tomorrow morning, and you're like, "Hey DL, how you doing?" Like let's just say that's all you say. Well, that's one chatter. Now, if you respond later or you come back on another day, you're still one chatter. So then I need 19 more. That requirement's going to be tough, right? Like that's going to be a bit on the challenging side. So we're going to see if we can't make it happen, right? And if we don't, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But with the help of such a wonderful audience, I imagine that's going to happen, right? So Sunday, speaking of Rumble, Sunday I did a relatively long episode. I did 2.5 hours, and I did a Liberty Dad versus Zoran Mamdani. I always struggle with that name, and that was Rumble Premium. So if you're a premium paying member, you can go watch that. If not, what I'm doing is I'm going through every one of his platform policies. He has about 20 of them. I went through the first 4 housing. It was a 2.5 hour show. So go figure how long, the whole entire series is going to end up being. But no worries. What I'm going to do is I did it Sunday night. And I think what I'm going to do going forward is every Sunday night, if you're a Rumble Premium member, you can look forward to the next installment of that series. That will allow me to get my Rumble Premium hours in because I always struggle with that. But then what I'm going to do is every Sunday, I will release the prior one. And then throughout the week, I'll probably, chop up some clips and put them out there and then, kind of open up the whole thing after the week is over. So that's what I'm going to do. So look forward to that. And the reason that I'm doing it is because he's insanely popular right now. He's getting a lot of attention. And I feel like what I'm seeing are just people going socialist, communist. And I'm like, well, you realize that socialist is not a dirty word anymore. I mean, maybe it should be, but it's not. And he got like 43% of the vote in the primary. So that should tell us we better get in gear and combat these ideas that I disagree with. So look out for clips on my socials, and then look out each Sunday, starting next Sunday for the full episode. All right. So tonight, what am I doing? Normally on Monday, I do a bill review Monday. Now this morning I got up extra early, to accommodate a dad that was going to help me out, especially with the numbers. And we did a 2-hour podcast. So I had Todd Hagopian on. And so that's not a bill review. That's a dad talk. We had an unscheduled dad talk. It was a last minute thing, literally at 11:30 last night. He was reaching out and he was like, "Hey, when can you do it?" And just the conversation led to, "How about tomorrow?" "Yes." "Okay, I'll go to bed right now." So, if you didn't see that, go ahead and check that out. So still bill review Monday. Now, I'm not really going to review a bill tonight. I'm going to do something a little different. And bill review is where we tackle these kind of things. So the Supreme Court handed Trump a win in Trump versus CASA. a case regarding birthright citizenship. Now, instead of reviewing that, it's 119 pages. I mean, come on. I thought we'd dig a little deeper. Now, Kentanji Brown Jackson, she was making the rounds in the headlines and in social media as a result of how she was referenced in that ruling. Actually, this one in particular, let's put it up on the screen here for you. So this is, I believe this is Justice Barrett writing, saying, "We will not dwell on Justice Jackson's argument, which is at odds with more than 2 centuries worth of precedent, not to mention the Constitution itself. We observe only this: Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary." Now, that's a pretty big slap down. I think there was a couple of other comments within the ruling that were kind of like, people were like, "Man, she got slapped down." Now, I don't read enough Supreme Court rulings to know, like, is this kind of thing common? Are they sharp with each other? I don't read enough to be able to tell you that, because I'm not a lawyer, just a guy that reads and likes to make sense of the things that I read. So that was going around. I saw that, and then that led to a wave of comments like this. Let's see what we got here. Nope, that's not where I want to go. I want to go this one right here. All right. So this is Charlie Kirk. We all know Charlie Kirk, right? Like, sometimes I agree with him, and a lot of the times I don't. So he said Kentanji Brown Jackson is a diversity hire. She's only there because she's a black woman. And in fairness to her, Biden did come out and say, "I'm going to hire a black woman." And then some people have, kind of like try to do some math and say, "All right, what are the odds that you're going to get a black woman that's qualified?" Blah, blah, blah. So big question. Was she a DEI hire? Was she qualified for the job? Well, first, let's look at how people talked about her. Okay, because I think this is going to be important for the fullness of this show tonight, because we're going to dig in, and what I'm going to try to show you is that the bigger problem is the American public, and you could even place guilt on our Senate by virtue of being elected by the public. So people responded to Charlie Kirk, and they said, this first one was funny. Grok, where did Kentanji Brown graduate from, and what are her qualifications? Okay, look, folks, can we stop being like Grok and then trying to dunk on people? Like, Grok is good, AI is good, and there's a lot of value to it. You can learn a lot, but it really shouldn't be, you shouldn't be like trying to dunk on somebody with Grok. Like, it's not that good. And the nature of ideas, as we'll see as we go along here tonight, the nature of ideas is that you should understand ideas and be able to place them in the wider world for which you exist. You can't do that. If you're not doing that, then you're just kind of wasting everybody's time, including yourself. But let's see what Grok had to say. Grok, it looks like I'm in the way here, so let me make myself a little bit smaller here. That's right, I said myself, because I can do what I want. It's my podcast. All right, so Kentanji Brown Jackson graduated from Harvard University with a bachelor's in government, magna cum laude in 1992, and earned her JD from Harvard Law School, cum laude in 1996, serving as a Harvard Law Review editor. Her qualifications include clerking for Justice Stephen Breyer, working as a federal public defender, serving as vice chairwoman of the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and judging on the U.S. District Court and Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit before her 2022 Supreme Court appointment. Okay, well, for the average person, that sounds pretty good. Like, how many people, like if you did a man on the street and you were like, "Yo, what are the qualifications, or what should the qualifications be for somebody to get on the Supreme Court?" I bet you most people couldn't come up with any kind of a meaningful, decent list, right? I mean, they might be able to tell you some of the bare minimum qualifications based on the law, but they're not going to be able to say, okay, well, they should probably have done this, and operated in this particular capacity so that they would be prepared for the challenges that they're going to face in the Supreme Court. Like, most people are not going to be able to tell you that. And in some ways, that's a bit of a problem. But we're not going to dwell on that. There's a lot we're not going to dwell on. Wah, wah. Okay. So she has some qualifications. Now, the interesting thing here is and I saw a lot of people do this. They're like, she graduated from Harvard. And like, you've never met somebody that graduated from Harvard and you're like, I don't know. I think you should give your degree back. You should ask for a refund. Because I've met people that I'm like, nah, you're not really that smart. Remember David Hogg? Everybody made fun of him. He went to Harvard, right? So I don't think that going to Harvard in itself means anything. A lot of people go to Harvard, and not all of them are necessarily the brightest and the best. Okay. And the other thing is Thomas Sowell. He made an interesting comment about Harvard. He said, having graduated from Harvard means that, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, means I never have to worry about being impressed by somebody that went to Harvard. Like, basically, that's about what it amounts to. Like, whoa, somebody went to Harvard? Wow. Now, there are some other schools where I think if you do go and you do pass, then their reputation still stands pretty tall, like MIT and such. But still, nonetheless, I imagine there are even people from MIT that are not as good as many other people from MIT. Right? That's how things work. So by virtue of that, doesn't mean you are, the person for that particular role. All right. So what else do people say? Let's see. We got here. She and Jasmine are poor reps for the black people. Okay. I kind of agree on Jasmine just because she acts like a bonehead. I don't know that Kentanji Brown is a poor representation. I mean, she's clearly intelligent, even if you disagree with her rulings. You're like, I mean, are you just saying she's dumb? Like, she did go to Harvard, and I know that I'm kind of backing away from this idea, but like, presumably, you're at least halfway intelligent, even if you're not the best. Anyway, certain whites do that on purpose. There are plenty of well-educated, well-spoken black females who could be in those positions. Okay, that's fair position. That's a fair argument to make. But the question is, how do you know? Like, based on what? What are you making that decision on? Right? Magna cum laude, graduate from Harvard, district court judge for 10 years, U.S. Courts of Appeal, judge, federal public defender, vice chair of U.S. Sentencing Committee. Try again. Okay. Again, if you're a lawyer and you're intimately familiar with all of this, then you might be able to make a case and say, yeah, these qualifications are good, and here's why. Right? But just listing them out is not sufficient. That doesn't work for me. You got to do more than that. KGB, it's KBJ, right? Just saying, was also appointed by an illegitimate president. Shouldn't that make her eligible to be removed? No, I don't think so, because she was confirmed by the Senate. Did you forget about that part there, USA? USA, that you couldn't even get her initials correct? 100% true. She's no more fit to be a Supreme Court justice than Kamala Harris was to be the vice president or the president. I mean, maybe. But again, based on what? What are we... Like, that's the important... Like, you can't just say, oh, she's dumber than a box of rocks. Okay? You need to demonstrate that. Because saying, oh, they don't belong there... Okay, well, you need to explain that. Otherwise, your argument is just as useful as, of course, she belongs there. Why? She went to Harvard. It's literally the opposite argument. Either you're bringing substance to the table or you're not. Plain and simple. As much as this will offend some people, it's 100% true. This is exactly how DEI works. Well, not really exactly. I covered DEI in a previous podcast, so I'll go check it out. But there's a little more than that. Like, it's not just like, oh, let's get some black people in here, whichever one comes first. First come, first serve, black folk. It's not really how it works. Okay? There are actually intricate moving parts, and there are other outcomes that can happen when you have DEI in place. So let's see. This is the last one. No, this is not the last one. We got a couple more. Actually... Whenever somebody starts with actually, I see that that meme, actually Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, I think it's Coney Barrett, are the DEI picks. Neither of them have substantial experiences. Sorry, Chuckles. Your administration is composed of DEI hires. Do you honestly think any normal president would ever hire Cash, Bondi, RFK Jr., Hegseth, and Gabbard? I don't know what those folk had to do with anything, but I can tell you that we seem to be ignoring all the confirmations that have to happen. That's a part of it. The president just the president, let's see, is it Colleen? Hopefully, Colleen, you understand that the president didn't get all of his picks because they didn't make it through Senate. That's how it almost all. I don't think any president has ever gotten all of the picks that they wanted. That's part of the confirmation process. So you can't just be like, oh, illegitimate president or Chuckles or whatever goofy name you're coming up with. All right, let's see what else we got. Charlie, remind us, where did you receive your law degree? Oh, snap. No, not at all. That has nothing to do with anything. This is so frustrating. Snickle is his name. Can you read? Can you read well? Can you comprehend what you read? Can you take two different things that you read and make some sort of connection between them or draw a conclusion, come up with a hypothesis? If you can do that, then you should be able to, in general, read and, have some opinions on our Supreme Court justices or our politicians. I mean, that is how our system was designed to be. It was not designed for all of us to go, well, I didn't go to Harvard. Guess I can't have an opinion even though I read a bunch. These are just bad arguments. It's plain and simple. All right, last one. Biden pledged to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court on 2/25/2020 and reiterated that pledge on 1/27/2022. This is where they get into it. Around 4% of law school grads are black women. Against the odds, he would have to know the best candidate was in that 4%. More specifically, he would have to have had foreknowledge of Kentanji Brown Jackson in particular. If not, she was a diversity hire. If my reasoning is in error, please let me know. Well, you're in luck, Peter. I'm going to let you know right now. So it's very possible that before President Biden came out and made that statement, he already had somebody in mind, so he could make that statement. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I'm just saying, the logic doesn't exclude that as a possibility. So sure, you could play the numbers and you could go, well, statistically speaking, the likelihood that a black woman was going to be the best person for the job is really low because, there's such low graduation rates and such low enrollment rates, yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, number one, first you have to prove that everybody is being hired because they are the best, as opposed to the president's choice. So this is how it really works, Peter. The president makes some choices based on what he believes, he or she believes, if we had a she, the justice will rule, right? We tend to look at this in terms of conservative and liberal. Very bad terms. We'll get into that in a moment. But that tends to be how we kind of drive this. And so the president goes out and he gets a list of people and they work out, okay, who's this person? What have they done? How have they ruled? What's their background look like? Yada, 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 all this other stuff. So it's very possible, number one, it's very possible that he had already had her in mind before he made that statement. It's also possible that that he went out and researched and determined this person is going to serve the what I am looking to accomplish with this seat. Because I don't think that they should be looking for the best, but what in the process has ever led you to believe that somebody didn't make it because they weren't the best? That somebody said, well, we found somebody else. Because you only have one confirmation hearing. The president says, I want this person. Then this person goes to the confirmation hearing. They go through the circus that it is, and then people vote. And then they determine whether or not this justice makes it to the Supreme Court. But at no time do they say, you know what? Your answers are interesting, but please, stay by your phone. We've got other candidates we want to interview, and we'll get back with you. Because that would be a way to find the best. So this whole 4% doesn't matter. It's not relevant. So yeah, your reasoning was quite in error, Peter. Very much so. Sorry to break the news to you, but I wouldn't be a good dad if I wasn't willing to do that, right? All right, so the real question ends up being like, okay, is she, at the end of the day, a DEI hire, or has America lost its way? So tonight, I'm going to draw upon a speech from 2005 given by the late Justice Antonin Scalia on constitutional interpretation. It's a 30-minute speech, but I've cut out just the parts that I think are relevant to make my point tonight. Now, my goal is to demonstrate that whatever flaws that KBJ has, the public has even more. Now, to set the stage, I want to define a few terms that you'll hear tonight. We're going to make it simple. So if you're a lawyer, if you're a constitutional scholar, not you, you know what I'm talking about. But if you're somebody that's in the know, you've got the training, you've debated this, give me some flexibility. I'm a lay guy just having a conversation about things I read. But I think I'm going to get it fairly accurate. I try to do my best to make sure that if I talk about something, when I talk about it, it's pretty accurate. You might need to add some nuance here and there, but it's pretty on the money. So originalism, that's the first term. This is where you interpret the Constitution based on its original meaning at the time that it was written. You emphasize the text, the fixed meaning of the text. You rely on historical context and the intent of the framers. The goal here is to limit judicial discretion, right? You're basically, you're just trying to say, okay, what did somebody else mean when they wrote this, right? And then you make your ruling based on that. Then you have something that you may not have heard called progressive originalism. It's a variant of originalism that focuses on the Constitution's broader principles. So like liberty, equality, so on and so forth. And it focuses on those principles rather than, say, the specific historical practices. It allows for modern application while still grounding interpretation in the original text. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then you have something called the living Constitution. It views the Constitution as this kind of dynamic document that evolves as society does. It emphasizes adaptability, allowing judges to interpret it in the light of, say, contemporary values and needs, rather than being bound by the original intent or the text alone. So it allows somebody to say, well, words change. And so, yeah, the word at the time that this was written, it meant this, but today it means something else. So therefore, that's how I'm going to interpret the Constitution. Right now, for me, I think living Constitution is a dastardly thing. Okay. Now, both progressive originalism and the living Constitution, they kind of aim to adapt the constitutional interpretation to modern text, but their methods vary a little bit. Progressive originalism seeks to apply the Constitution's broad principles, like I said earlier, liberty and equality, to contemporary issues, but stay rooted in the original text. Okay, living Constitution prioritizes, those evolving social values, and both of them have a very similar end goal, that it's relevance to the modern society. It's similar, but progressive originalism is a little bit more tethered to the Constitution's original framework. So, for the purposes of the show, being a lay guy and all, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll admit that up front. So I might get this all wrong, and hopefully not, because I don't want to waste your time. But I think it's fair to say that originalism is open to arriving at conclusions that a judge may disagree with, whereas progressive originalism and living Constitution, well, they're more open to arriving at rulings that are aligned with modern sensibilities or personal views, right? So I think there's more flexibility there within the framework. So if I come in and I have a particular value, and I'm either a progressive, I approach constitutional interpretation through progressive originalism, or I approach it through living Constitution, I think either one of those would make it easier for me to resolve a case that's aligned with my personal values, where I think I kind of got to lie about it if I'm an originalist. Not that I can't do it, but I kind of got to lie about it or be dishonest. But you can still do it, right? But the framework, if you follow it, I think doesn't necessarily allow, and we'll get into that. We'll see how that actually looks in practice. So that's just kind of like a little bit of a foundation. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a quick intermission, kind of get some water real quick, and then we'll be right back. Just like 2 or 3 minutes. We'll be right back, and then we're going to dive into this video from Antonin Scalia, and we're going to see what we can learn, and if I can demonstrate that it is the public that is more of a problem than whatever problems they see Kentanji Brown Jackson having. So let's go to intermission. We'll be right back. Hey, Liberty fam, do me a favor. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to my channel. And for the really serious folks out there, I want you to hit that bell so that you never miss an episode. By the way, if you want to support the show, head over to libertydad.locals.com and sign up. For $5, you can be part of this show. There, I'll engage supporters of the show. We'll discuss topics that you want me to talk about, response videos that you would like to see, or anything related to the show. And I'll even have a monthly subscribers only episode. By the way, I'm always looking for dads to join me for Dad Talk. That's my series where I invite everyday dads on to talk about what's important to them in the context of being a dad. No argument, no debate, and dads choose the topic. It's my way of raising dad voices. If you're a dad or you know a dad who has something to say, let's get connected. Episodes air live on Friday mornings or Friday evenings, whichever works best for dads. All right, let's get back to the show. Okay, so we're back, and we're going to dive right in here, and we're going to see what it is that we can learn. So I want to play this first clip. Now, again, you can find this on C-SPAN, the full 1 hour. I think it's an hour, maybe an hour and a half. The full show is from 2005. I think it's very interesting. He's a little on the drier side for this, but I think if you can, I mean, hopefully I've got the clips so that it's not too dry, but I mean the whole thing, and because he speaks a little bit slower, and he's just the way that he talks. I think it's not as entertaining as you might be used to with many of the podcasts out there today. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to diss him or anything. But like the first video here comes from that, and the videos are all in order. But I think that you'll find if you go watch the whole thing in its totality, you'll learn a whole lot because this is probably the legal, content that I consumed that really had the most impact on me. And I'm not saying it's like the most impactful one out there. I'm just saying for me, this one really helped set straight a lot of falsehoods that I had going on in my mind. So let's play this first one. We'll get this over here. Make sure I don't have any of the others. Okay, here we go. Boom, boom.
Not very long ago, originalism was orthodoxy. Everybody at least purported to be an originalist. If you go back and read the commentaries on the Constitution by Joseph Story, he didn't think that the Constitution evolved or changed. He said it means and will always mean what it meant when it was adopted. Or consider the opinions of John Marshall in the federal bank case, where he says we must always remember it is a constitution we are expounding, and since it's a constitution, he says you have to give its provisions expansive meaning so that they will accommodate events that you do not know of, which will happen in the future. Well, if it's a constitution that changes, you wouldn't have to give it an expansive meaning. You can give it whatever meaning you want, and when future necessity arises, you simply change the meaning.
Okay, so first up, he's kind of setting the stage, not only for his talk, but also for my talk, incidentally, that originalism, once upon a time, was orthodoxy. That's what everybody, like you said, either claimed to believe or actually did believe. So that, and he makes the point in his talk that there are that at the time of his talk in 2005, he was actually in the minority, and that a lot of people were being persuaded by the living Constitution. And so then this talk goes in to discuss some of the problems that he sees with a living Constitution. So, and again, what we're trying to do is we're going to get to where, okay, the public, because my claim here is that the public has a bit of a problem. So, speaking of the public, let's see what he has to say about them. And we're going to play this next clip.
Not just the judges and scholars believed in originalism, but even the American people. Consider the 19th Amendment, which is the amendment that gave women the vote. It was adopted by the American people in 1920. Why did we adopt a constitutional amendment for that purpose? The Equal Protection Clause existed in 1920. It was adopted right after the Civil War. And you know that if that issue of the franchise for women came up today, we would not have to have a constitutional amendment. Someone would come to the Supreme Court and say, like, Your Honors, what in a democracy, what could be a greater denial of equal protection than denial of the franchise? And the court would say, yes, even though it never meant it before, the Equal Protection Clause means that women have to have the vote. But that's not the way the American people thought in 1920. In 1920, they looked at the Equal Protection Clause and they said, what does it mean? Well, it clearly doesn't mean that you cannot discriminate on the basis of discriminate in the franchise, not only on the basis of sex, but on the basis of property ownership, on the basis of literacy. None of that was unconstitutional. And therefore, since it wasn't unconstitutional and we wanted it to be, we did things the good old-fashioned way and adopted an amendment.
Okay, so the point that he's making here, he's saying, like, look, if you go back to the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, by the public themselves, they looked at the Constitution from the perspective of originalism, because they looked and they said, looks like the right to vote is not guaranteed to women, but we think it should be. So the American public had a debate, and then they went and they went through the process of amending the Constitution to include that. And so when you see those kind of things, you get two very clear points that you can draw from them. Number one, the Constitution can change, right? Because you're changing it. That's how it was designed. It was designed to be changed. It was designed to be light, but at the same time, okay, what if something changes about society and we need to ensure, or what if society changes? What if they determine overall that they don't believe in a thing, or they do believe in a thing, or whatever? Well, then they have a process for which they can go and they can change it. And now when the legislature goes and makes laws, those laws have to, or are supposed to, comport with the Constitution. In other words, they should be constitutional. So that is a way of kind of elevating an idea to, like, you can almost think of it like elevating an idea to supremacy, right? Like, supreme law of the land is the Constitution, and you can't just pass laws willy-nilly that disregard that. So then you have, so that's the first point. And then you have the fact that that people were willing to engage and debate about it and make the change, right? So you have the. Did I get that right? I think I might have missed one of my points on that. But the point being is that the public, when you go back and you look, you can see that they could generally be considered originalist by the way that they approached the Constitution. They read it, they said, it's not in there, let's put it in there, right? And then they went through the process of doing that. And it's that simple. Because for somebody like me, I look at the Constitution and I say, it says what it says. It doesn't say what it doesn't say. right? And it sounds kind of like people don't like hearing that. But I think the reason they don't like hearing that is because they've forgotten that we have a process for changing it. So we could just say like, "Hey, it's not in there, but you're right. Maybe it should be. Let's have a debate about that and see how we might include it. Let's see, what language we might include." And to be to make this like easy for you to understand, if you go to your HOA, if you go to any body, right, that has bylaws and some sort of structure for officers and whatnot, you will find that they have a similar setup. There are some like higher level rules. These are the fundamental ones for which everything else must respect. And then if you want to change those, then the threshold for changing them is higher. So the threshold to amend the Constitution is higher than it is to pass legislation, right? And you can also go forward and you can say, well, passing legislation, if Congress decides that on a piece of legislation, they send it to the president's desk. If the president vetoes it, well, then that threshold to pass it anyway goes up, right? Because again, as I've talked about in the past, we have a society that's been built around the idea of checks and balances. And part of the checks and balances can include, hey, if you want to make a change here, you have a higher threshold to make it. But once you get past that threshold, guess what? That becomes effectively the supreme law of the land, right? And then from there, everything is supposed to be in submission or it's in violation, like any legislation regarding that, right? And then that's where you get into the debates and the judiciary branch, interpreting the Constitution and so on and so forth. So the public was originalist. The scholars were originalist. The lawyers were originalist. The judges were originalist. So let's go on to this next video here, because we're creating a bit of a narrative here, and I just want to lay a foundation. I want you to understand why I look at this and say, well, whatever you may think of Kentanji Brown Jackson, I keep wanting to say just two names, Kentanji Brown Jackson, whatever you may think of her, scan back or pan back and look at society as a whole. I think you have a bigger problem. And hopefully I can demonstrate that tonight. All right, so let's see what this next clip says.
What are the arguments usually made in favor of the living Constitution? As the name of it suggests, I mean, it's a very attractive philosophy, and it's hard to talk people out of it. The notion that the Constitution grows. The major argument is that, look, the Constitution is a living organism. It has to grow with the society that it governs, or it will become brittle and snap. This is the equivalent of an anthropomorphism, equivalent to what you hear from your stockbroker when he tells you that the stock market is resting for an assault on the 1100 level. See the stock market panting at some base camp. The stock market is not a mountain climber, and the Constitution is not a living organism, for Pete's sake. It's a legal document. And like all legal documents, it says some things and it doesn't say other things.
Okay. So he's laying this foundation. He's like, look, and I think that quote, it says what it says. It doesn't say what it doesn't say. I think that's a direct quote from him from somewhere else. So unfortunately, that's not my clever saying. But he's made the point here. And again, he's an originalist and he's making the argument that, hey, originalism is proper, whereas the living Constitution is not proper. And he's going into why. Now, what we're not going to do is we're not going to dive into the nuts and bolts of why one is preferred necessarily over the other. What I want to do, and what I'm trying to show you, is where society was, and then kind of demonstrate where we are now, and then point out, I think that represents a major problem. Now, one of the big problems, and this is probably the most profound part, that thing that I've learned from Antonin Scalia, and it's dealing with the difference between liberals and conservatives. And when I learned about Antonin Scalia, and then I started like reading some of his stuff and watching some of his videos, I was a diehard conservative Republican. Okay. Now, that had nothing to do with me converting to libertarianism. I'm just telling you where I was at the time. And at the time, I made many of the mistakes that today I would criticize conservatives and liberals for. So let's play this next clip, and then we're going to get into the distinction between liberal and conservative, because I think a lot of people make a lot of mistakes. I'm going to point them out in just a second here. So let's check it out.
Some people also seem to like it because they think it's
Now, when he says it, he's again talking about the living Constitution, just so we're clear. I was trying to keep these clips short, so sometimes I may have clipped something off that, kind of makes it not sound quite so, it kind of sound a little bit out of place.
it's a good liberal thing that somehow this is a conservative liberal battle, and conservatives like the old-fashioned originalist Constitution, and liberals ought to like the living Constitution. That's not true either. I mean, the dividing line between those who believe in the living Constitution and those who don't is not the dividing line between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives are willing to grow the Constitution to cover their favorite causes, just as liberals are.
Okay, so I cut out the part where he goes into a couple of cases. I just felt like it was a little bit more than necessary, but he's correct. So how can you tell this just as a regular lay person? And you're like, well, how would I know without reading all of these different court cases and evaluating what the public's saying? I can give you a super duper easy way to understand this. And I wish I'd grabbed the screenshots of them. When Amy Coney Barrett was being confirmed, when she was going through a confirmation hearing, and then after she got confirmed, I tweeted out, I said, I can't wait until I see the headlines that she disappoints conservatives. So when a judge or a justice is confirmed and they're determined to be either liberal or conservative, just wait. Mark your calendar, do something. Just wait, because you're going to find headlines, and it won't take very long. It'll be within a year. You will find a headline where it says so-and-so disappoints liberals or conservatives, or to the shock of conservatives, so-and-so, ruled against them. And there's a reason for that. And that's because the jurisprudence, what guides the justices, is not liberal or conservative per se. And we're going to see that demonstrated here in just a moment from Antonin Scalia. But that's the one thing you need to know. Now, let me tell you something. Antonin Scalia was like best friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they were totally polar opposite on the court. She was definitely the more liberal, to a degree, a feminist. I wouldn't really call her a feminist, even though she might qualify. But I believe that she was very intellectual in the matters of the law. And while she may have had feminine idea or feminist ideas, I think that first and foremost, she had a respect for the law and how, government or just the legal issues or the legal aspect of our society. So I would kind of like prioritize that if I was describing her, but she would definitely, qualify as a feminist on some level. But her and Antonin Scalia were actually like best friends. And if you go back, you'll find that they would go out to dinner together. They would invite each other to each other's houses, and they had a good family relationship. But they also had a really good working relationship where they would personally critique each other's drafts. So Antonin Scalia would send his draft to Ginsburg. She would mark it up or whatever and send it back. And then she would do the same thing. She would send hers, and then she would send it back. And then he would send it back to her. And they would do that sometimes several times to kind of help work out their ideas. Right. And they would, and that's actually a really good idea. Like, if you think about it for a second, like if you're just passing it to somebody that already agrees with you, they're probably not going to find the quote unquote mistakes or the areas where you could be better. But he was definitely conservative. She was definitely liberal. And yet they had this great relationship, and they worked with each other to help develop their opinions for the rulings. So I just think that was kind of interesting, and that was probably a turning point for me in how I would view the court system or the court. I guess the judicial branch. We'll put it that way. That was a turning point for me because up until then, I generally was just like, oh, you got a conservative judge. They're a conservative, and they're clearly ruling like a conservative. Now, their jurisprudence, the way that they judge, may have something to do. There may be an overlap, but like Antonin Scalia said, you cannot guarantee that they're going to, if they're a conservative, that they will always rule as a conservative. You cannot guarantee that the liberals will always rule as a liberal. And it's just a matter of time until that headline comes out and says, this person has disappointed their crowd, if you will. So keep that in mind. All right, let's get to this next video here, this next clip. So I like this one a lot because it's, even though he said it in 2005, there's some stuff in here that's relevant in 2025, 20 years later. So let's take a listen. Maybe. What happened there?
If you don't believe in originalism, then you need some other principle of interpretation. Being a non-originalist is not enough. You see, I have my rules that confine me. I know what I'm looking for. When I find it, the original meaning of the Constitution, I am handcuffed. If I believe that the First Amendment meant when it was adopted that you are entitled to burn the American flag, I have to come out that way, even though I don't like to come out that way. When I find that the original...
I want to pause here for just a second. There's another video that you can find if you really look for it. And I wish I could remember how he said it, but it was something, and it was good. It was great. He said something along the line of like, if it were up to me, I would throw every scruffy faced, bearded, hippie liberal that burns the American flag in jail. And then he follows it up. I totally butchered it because it's way better than what I just said. But then he follows it up and he says, but I am not king. And so Antonin Scalia, he believed that, hey, I have these governing rules. Once I figure out where an idea sits within those rules, then I have to follow those rules. End of story. It's kind of like if you say, like a lot of in the libertarian community, there's a lot of people that are peaceful parents. So that means they don't believe in spanking their child, right? So that's their rule. So if they say, okay, I don't spank my kid ever, then that means when their kid is acting their worst, they're bound, just like what he said. And they got to find some other path. Now, in law, you're probably not going to find another path, but I'm just trying to make somewhat of an analogy that helps make it make sense, right? And so you're bound. You're like, okay, I don't do that. I got to do something else. What else can I do? What else fits within the rules that I'm bound by, right? And then you can act in that particular manner, even though you may want to slap your child upside their head, right? Maybe, and look, stop judging, folks. Don't pretend like you ain't never thought about smacking somebody and then realized, I really shouldn't have thought that. Don't even pretend. And probably your kid too. You know, you're just like, George, you're making me so angry, I just want to spank you, right? You know, like, let's not pretend, okay? And so, but you get bound. And so he's telling us, he's like, as an originalist, what binds me is when I look and I evaluate and I interpret the Constitution based on what I understand, what the evidence shows to me that the people who wrote it, how they understood it at the time. All right, so let's continue. Let's continue this video.
Meaning of the jury trial guarantee is that any additional time you spend in prison, which depends upon a fact, must depend upon a fact found by a jury.
This actually is interesting. I'm going to back it up because I want you to hear it again. Just pay very close attention and see if you can absolutely guess what I'm about to say, because I'm about to say something that's relevant to today.
even though I don't like to come out that way. When I find that the original meaning of the jury trial guarantee is that any additional time you spend in prison, which depends upon a fact, must depend upon a fact found by a jury. Once I find that that's what the jury trial guarantee means, I am handcuffed. Though I'm a law and order type, I cannot do all of the mean conservative things I would love to do to the society.
That's kind of funny. Okay. Can you guess? I wish I had some music to play and I could be like, all right, do, 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 right? Kind of make it a little bit more interesting. But I don't have that kind of music right now. So can you just guess where I may be going? If you just so happen to guess that I'm going to say that this applies to the case with Abrego Garcia, the MS-13 Maryland man that got sent to the El Salvador prison. If that's you, man, are you correct? Okay? Because what Antonin Scalia here just said was there is a jury trial guarantee. You have the right to a jury. And by the way, it's not limited to citizens. It's for people. And he said, when you're going to spend more time in prison, when the punishment changes on the basis of a fact, then that fact has to be deliberated by a jury. That's not what happened with Abrego Garcia. And I did an episode where I walked through the timeline. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. I just wanted to point it out because as I was preparing for the show, I was listening and I was like, wait a minute. No way. Like it just never dawned on me, right? And so you can go back to that episode where I lay out the timeline and we show that there were certain point, like he got deported before certain information came out about him. Some of the more nastier stuff like domestic violence and was he a human trafficker and all this other stuff, right? So he got punished, he got sent somewhere. And then the administration tried to come out and say, well, he deserved it because of this, this, and this, and this. Like, okay, if the government is imposing or in some way retroactively imposing punishment based on this evidence that you found, it would require he get a jury trial. All right. Or more importantly, and I would argue this, I could be wrong, but I would say if they knew about it, but didn't tell people, and then when everybody started screaming and throwing a big fit about it, then they told us, well, then that would mean that you knew about it ahead of time and you didn't give this man a jury trial. Okay. And we are talking about sending somebody to a third world prison. So I just want to point that out real quick. We're not talking about a simple deportation. We're talking about sending somebody to prison. Okay. And like he just said, when there's a fact that changes the punishment, you get a jury for it. Let's continue listening to the rest of his commentary here.
You got me. Now, if you're not going to control your judges that way, what other criterion are you going to place before them?
Okay, that's a great question, right? And it's not that there isn't an answer, but it would seem that there's not a really fixed answer when it comes to the living Constitution. And he doesn't, at this particular talk, he doesn't talk about progressive originalism. And I didn't bother to look up and find out, okay, when did that become a thing and popular, blah, blah, blah. I don't really know. It does seem to me that it was kind of in response to, a lot of people really coming out against the living Constitution. I can't be sure of that. I could be wrong, but that's kind of the impression that I have. Okay. And so he doesn't talk about progressive originalism here, but he is talking about the living Constitution. However, the idea applies for all three. What is the foundation that governs a judge when they're making a decision, right? When they're faced with some evidence and they have to come back and say, here is my ruling. What is the framework that guides them? And more importantly, what is the framework that restrains them? Because like he just told you, he said, look, he said, my framework doesn't allow me to do all the mean and nasty things that I would actually like to do to people. Because he's like, I'm a conservative. I'm law and order. I would be harsh. He might actually, fall on the side of a dictator if he had full on power, right? But he recognized he doesn't have full-on power, and he recognized that he has a judicial philosophy that governs how he approaches matters of the law. And then he uses that framework to make a decision, of course, with all the evidence and information that's presented. But he uses that framework to get to where he is, and where he gets maybe a place where he's handcuffed, or maybe a place where the idea, the end result, the outcome matches what he might personally prefer in the first place. Now, since he mentioned flags, how about a red flag? What do you think? A red flag sound good? How about this?
People that burn the American flag should go to jail for 1 year. That's what they should be doing. 1 year. And we'll see if we can get that done. We're going to try and get that done. We're working with some of your senators.
Okay. So I want you to think about that for a moment. I want you to think about what Antonin Scalia said. It's been widely established very well that burning the American flag is constitutional. So if it's constitutional, what cannot happen? Well, if you said he can't just go and get with some senators and draft legislation, then you're correct, right? That cannot, it's constitutional. You have a constitutional right to burn the American flag, whether you like it or not. But did you notice, because I'm talking about the public, did you notice that he's standing in a crowd? Now, I think that crowd was largely military, and they kind of cheered. There are other videos where he was on the campaign trail, and he said the same thing, and he had a larger audience, and they really cheered. What does that tell you? That tells you that there are a large number of people in this country that seem to have no framework for which they operate. They have no governing rules when they're looking at rights and the Constitution and civil liberties, so on and so forth. They don't have one. They're kind of shooting from the hip. Or perhaps you could argue and say many people are deciding where they think a case should end up based on whether or not they're a conservative, or they're a liberal, or they're a moderate, or something in between, somewhere in between, or whatever, right? Libertarian, who's not really in between, but whatever, right? They've got some sort of framework that they're, but it's more of their social positions, not a legal framework. And so the question he asked is, okay, well, the living constitutionist, if you will, what is their framework? What is their guiding principle? What are their governing rules? And so I'm asking, well, what are the public's governing rules? They should have some too, right? Because we influence our legislation. We influence, like we can call up our Senate and say, don't you dare vote for that justice. And then they all vote against it, against the person. And then the president has to go and find somebody else, right? That could happen. And so I think it's wise and worth understanding what are the public's governing rules, because that matters. And we can start to see that they don't seem to have an appropriate one for the legal matters, or at least at a very minimum. Maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit, but at a very minimum, they at least don't respect the fact that we've already settled this issue of burning the flag. They're just busy being on board Trump. So let's look at this next video, because we're getting close to where I think I'm making my case, and you guys can let me know in the comments if I've made my case well. So here's this next. We got like 2 more clips here, and then if we got some other stuff. So let's check it out. Nope. There we go.
You heard in the introduction that I was confirmed close to 19 years ago now by a vote of 98-0. The 2 missing were Barry Goldwater and Jake Garn. So, make it 100.
What did you think about that? Think about all the fighting you saw with Amy Coney Barrett, Kentanji Brown Jackson, and then even Brett Kavanaugh. Think about all the arguing, the fighting. Is he going to get confirmed? Blah, blah, blah. And then Antonin Scalia, and I think he had been, I don't know the exact date that he was confirmed, but I think it was 20 years prior to this speech. Roughly 20 years. So basically about 40 years ago. And he actually sailed through with 98 votes, and he claims it would have been 100 if the other 2 had been present. I guess they weren't there. Right? So think about that for a second. Think about the difference. And by the way, since I'm talking about confirmation hearings, if you go back and you look, you will find out that Ruth Bader Ginsburg who is a huge believer in the right to abortion, you'll find out that when she was actually going through her confirmation hearing, she had written legal articles or articles, grounded in legal theory, where she was disagreeing with what she called the structure of Roe v. Wade. So she agreed with the outcome. She didn't agree with how they approached it. And that actually made a lot of feminists skeptical of her, because they were like, all right, is she really going to be a woman to protect women's rights? Just thought you might find that fact kind of interesting. Okay. Because I think, and I might do this just if I can find some spare time. I need a laugh track for that one, like spare time. Anyway, but I think I would actually like to go back and watch, or at least kind of skip through some of the old Senate hearings for Supreme Court justices, because I would be interested in just kind of seeing, like, what's the difference, 20, 30, 40 years ago compared to today. I'm willing to bet they were probably a little bit on the rowdy side. I think Congress has long been a place where you've got a lot of grandstanding, so I'm not suggesting that they were like nice and perfect and everybody asked really, meaningful questions and all that. But I'm willing to bet that there's a visible difference on the better side. I could be wrong. Maybe it's always been a circus. But so that was interesting. So, yeah. So like he's been voted in 98 and then likely would have been 100. So that says something a lot about him and the process or the people. It says something interesting. So let's continue listening to him.
I was known at that time to be, in my political and social views, fairly conservative. But still, I was known to be a good lawyer, an honest man, somebody who could read a text and give it its fair meaning, had, judicial impartiality and so forth. And so I was unanimously confirmed. Today, barely 20 years later, it is difficult to get someone confirmed to the Court of Appeals.
Okay. The Court of Appeals, that's a lower court, right? That's not as esteemed, if you will, as the Supreme Court. And he's saying, like, look, it's hard just to get him here. Now that's interesting. Let's hear let's hear why he says that.
What has happened? The American people have figured out what is going on.
Oh, wow. DL, aren't you a brilliant one? Antonin Scalia in 2005 pointed out that something has changed with the public. And here I am criticizing half the internet and saying, you guys are all wrong about this whole DEI thing. That's just your intellectually lazy answer because you don't even bother to read the Supreme Court rulings. I'm going to tell you a story about that in just a moment. Let's continue listening.
If we're selecting lawyers, if we're selecting people to read a text and give it the fair meaning it had when it was adopted, yes, the most important thing to do is to get a good lawyer. If, on the other hand, we're picking people to draw out of their own conscience and experience a new constitution with all sorts of new values to govern our society, then we should not look principally for good lawyers. We should look principally for people who agree with us.
Does that sound even remotely familiar? Think back to Kentanji Brown Jackson. Think back to Amy Coney Barrett. Think back to Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh is a really good one to use because a lot of people, like a lot of women, they were like, that was the believe all women, it was like Me Too second time around or something like that, right? Whatever. And so a lot of people really sided with his accuser. And nobody was really talking about, his judicial anything. They weren't really discussing that a whole lot. All we wanted to talk about was, is this the guy I would let around my daughter? And then a lot of people would say, no, I'm not. Why? Well, because he's been accused credibly. And like, okay, well, what makes it credible? Right. We're not going to rehash all that. But the point being is that it really seemed like at the time, people were indulging in, how might you say that? They were overindulging in the idea of guilt more so than they normally do. So normally you see a story online or in the news and you don't like it and you automatically have negative attitude toward the person. And that's a problem because in our country, if that person's judged by a jury of their peers, that's me and you, then that means if I've already set my face against him and I said, this person is already, clearly an evil person, how could he hurt that poor little woman or kid or whatever. And number one, he's not going to get a fair jury trial. But number two, I'm distorting the purpose of this system, right? By not constraining myself. So I think I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but ultimately, I think he's onto something when he says the people have changed. And to some degree, we've always been this way. Like the court of public opinion has always been a thing. You can go back and you can read in the Bible, and my position on the Bible. It's one of two things. It's either spiritually accurate, right? It's legitimate and everything actually did happen, or it's a reflection of what people observed and saw and wrote down, even made up stories, but they had to make them up in a way that sounded plausible to other people. So they based their stories on likely or real life things that they have observed, right? So one way or another, they're true. Okay. And where was I going at that point? I got a little jumpy on that one. Okay. Well, if I remember that, I can't remember where I was going at that point. Oh, yeah. So I was talking about the public. And so if you look, there was the issue with Jesus and Barabbas, right? And so they were like, who do you want? They're like, Barabbas. And, Jesus was the guy that was innocent and Barabbas was the convicted murderer. And so the crowd, they clearly chose him for whatever reason. Maybe maybe he was a political guy that they really liked and said a lot of good things. Who knows, right? Maybe he was an influencer back then. I have no idea. But you can see where, to some degree, the public has kind of always had this streak in them. So the real question is, has the public changed and to what degree? All right, let's continue listening.
The majority as to whether there ought to be this right, that right, and the other right. We want to pick people who will write the new Constitution that we would want. And that's why you hear in the discourse on this subject, people talking about moderate. We want moderate judges. What is a moderate interpretation of a text? Halfway between what it really means and what you'd like it to mean is there's no such thing as a moderate interpretation of a text. Would you ask a lawyer, draw me a moderate contract? The only way the word has any meaning is if you are looking for somebody to write a law, to write a constitution.
Okay, so I think I ended it a little bit like a second too early, but he's getting to this point now where, and his point is not the same as mine. I'm just kind of bouncing off of what he said, but he's getting to this point where he's like, look, the public, he starts out and he tells you that once upon a time, the public was, by observation of their behaviors, they were largely originalist. And so now he's looking and he's saying, hey, guess what? 20 years after I was confirmed, we find that it's very difficult to get somebody confirmed to these lower courts. What's happened? Well, the public they've figured out some things. They've realized that, who you put in there matters, but he's kind of saying like, it might matter in a negative way and you not realize it. So a lot of people are looking at it and saying, well, do they agree with me? Is that something that I believe? Well, then yes, they should be a judge. But that's actually not that's not a good way to think of things, right? We want judges that will sometimes tell us no, right? Because if I was always right, then I should be the judge. But we know that I'm not always right, and neither are you. And so sometimes somebody has to be there to tell us no. And in the case of judges, how do they tell us no? Well, he's pointing out they need to have this foundational framework for which they operate. And he's also telling you that some people have something else, whatever that something else is. And then he goes on to say, well, the people, there's an issue with the people. And the people largely are responsible for many of these justices because, again, we can call up our Senate and say, hey, you vote for that person or don't you dare vote for that person, right? And we can start making a lot of noise. So do you see where I'm kind of getting to this point of saying, like, look, the public and the American public and the US Senate have failed the Constitution. Why? I think that we have kind of been lulled into, like, maybe not call it living Constitution, but there should be a term to describe where the public is, where they're not looking for somebody to judge the text within a certain guideline that will either handcuff them or give them some freedom to rule as they see appropriate, right? That's not where we are now. And that, I think, is a problem. So let me continue. I've got one more video here. Well, not one more, but I got one more of his videos. So let's check this out. There we go.
When the Senate interrogates nominees to the Supreme Court or to the lower courts, Judge so-and-so, do you think there's a right to this in the Constitution? You don't. Well, my constituents think that there ought to be, and I'm not going to point to the court. Somebody's not going to find that. When we are in that mode, you realize we have rendered the Constitution useless, because the Constitution will mean what the majority wants it to mean.
All right. Do you see where we're getting? Do you see why I'm saying the American public? Because at the end of the day, the American public, they are the majority, right? That's effectively how it ends up working. I mean, we have all these systems in place, but ultimately it ends up being the majority. If the majority of us, reach out to our senators, and the majority of the senators follow what their constituents who've reached out to them say they want, and then they put a justice in there who has maybe more freedom with their jurisprudence, right? They're not necessarily bound like Scalia is, where he says, look, I hate flag burners. I'd throw their asses in jail, but I can't because my framework stops me right here. Now I'm locked. I can't do anything because you have that right. It's here, right? So this all, you can call this, we're going to make up a term just to be funny. You can call this trickle down law. I know it's corny, whatever. Like trickle down in economics, which is not a thing. And so I'm making up something else that's kind of not a thing. Okay, sorry. You know what? I'll let other people do their comedy. I'll just go back to doing my talking. So let's listen in. Let's see what he ends up saying here.
The senators are representing the majority.
Boom.
And they will be selecting justices who will devise a constitution that the majority wants.
Yep.
And that, of course, deprives the Constitution of its principal utility. The Bill of Rights is meant to protect you and me against, whom do you think? The majority. My most important function on the Supreme Court is to tell the majority to take a walk.
So you should want somebody on the Supreme Court who will tell you no and say, here is this constraint. I'm making, good judgments based on this, set of principles. And so therefore, sometimes you might hear yes, sometimes you might hear no. All right. So now he talked about, like the Senate, and I'm not going to play a bunch of videos, but I want to play one just to jog your memory, since we're talking about Kentanji Brown Jackson. I always have to say it a little bit slower. So I want to play this clip here. See if you remember this.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition?
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah.
I can't.
You can't?
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not a
believe the meaning
biologist.
of
Okay. She got roasted for that. Remember that? Man, everybody was like, oh, you can't define a woman. Ha, ha, ha. You diversity hire. That's because you're black, blah, blah, blah. Like all these crazy things. But you know what people weren't saying? They weren't saying, what is the judicial philosophy that guides you? That's not a very complicated question. I mean, if you're interested enough in paying attention to Supreme Court nominations, I think that's a fair question. Like, that's reasonable for you to think of. If you're just some person out there that votes, based on your party or what your, friends tell you to vote or whatever, or whatever you see on TV, but you're not really getting that interested in things. You don't go fact check people. You don't go read court documents. You don't do any of that kind of stuff. You just kind of go on about your way. Well, then sure, that would be that would be a difficult or an unfair question to say, I think you should have asked that. But for all those other people that were invested in even having the conversation, they should have asked that. But it wasn't asked. And that's what I think is part of the problem here. This is why I say the American public has failed the Constitution. Because at the end of the day, we had our Senate confirm people that may or may not have the same judicial philosophy as us if we spent a few minutes thinking about it. Now, I do want to touch really quickly on her judicial philosophy. So let me put this up on the screen here, just because I want to read a couple of things, just briefly. I do want to touch upon it. Let's see here. Why is this not Let's see here. Okay, there we go. Okay, perfect. I don't know why it always seems to go away. All right, so this comes from the American Bar Association. And when was this written? This was written August of 2023. Justice Jackson, report card from Supreme Court scholars. So these are people that not only are interested in this stuff, but they spend their time researching it, debating it, so on and so forth. That doesn't make them always accurate, but they're at least in the game, right? Like they know enough to have these kind of conversations. So here's what they said. In her first year on the bench, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Kentanji Brown Jackson has not been reluctant to offer strong dissents and has advocated a legal concept known as progressive originalism, drawing upon a legal doctrine touted by conservatives but directed by her to a different era of the American history. So then it goes down here and they say, while the court's more conservative wing has pushed originalism, meaning interpretation of the law should follow the intent of the framers of the U.S. Constitution, Jackson has employed progressive originalism during the past term. In short, she has reasoned that the 14th Amendment was intended by its framers to be race conscious instead of race neutral. And argued that in the past Civil War Reconstruction era, the amendment was drafted for the purpose of ensuring freedom of people who had been discriminated against. Did anything like that whatsoever come out? No, none of it did. Most people might not even understand what all of that means. What that basically said is that progressive originalism kind of draws a part of its foundation in the 14th Amendment, right? And so let me pull this up. I'm trying to look at it. So, and the idea that instead that it was intended by its framers to be race conscious instead of race neutral. So the foundation of her judicial philosophy focuses on, yes, originalism, where there's a concern for the intent, but there's also this intent that's ascribed to the 14th Amendment that in some ways isn't that different from the living Constitution because, and we're not going to get into it, but just quickly enough to say that this line of thinking allows you to be more fluid and dynamic with the world around you. So it's kind of similar to a living Constitution where the living Constitution might say something like, okay, a word meant this thing way back then when it was written, but today it means this. So therefore, that's what this passage of text means now because it relies on modern definition. So that would be living Constitution. Where the progressive originalism is a little different is it relies on part of its foundation in the 14th Amendment, but the view that the 14th Amendment itself was broad and open, right? Kind of like a living Constitution. So when she looks at race-related issues, she's going to look at it through those lenses, right? And this is a legal framework. This isn't just liberal or conservative or do you agree with me? Do you support, women's rights, those kind of things. So I think that our own society, like if people are mad that she's on the Supreme Court and they're complaining, let me just point out, you are supposed to be the boss. You tell Congress what you want them to do. Congress works out, like different representatives and, the 2 state senators, they work out who they need to answer to, and then they're supposed to do what they're told to do, right? And then they collectively come together and they make a decision based on their bosses on who gets to be in the Supreme Court. Yet, all the conversation was about was, can you define a woman? And there was nothing at all that I remember, at least I don't remember any conversation about it, that really got into, okay, what is the foundation of your judicial philosophy? Where does it lead you? At what point would your hands be tied, similar to Antonin Scalia, in a case related to this? I don't know if she could actually, answer that, but, those would be the kind of questions that you actually want answers to, because that's going to tell you what kind of judge they will be. You'll more likely, have an idea, I assume, in a given case where they might fall, if the case is simple, or if it's more complex, maybe not. Right. But at the end of the day, what you would end up getting is you get what Antonin Scalia told us: somebody that would be willing to tell the majority, take a hike. Now you might say, well, Dale, you're just saying this to be contrary. You're just defending her now, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, let me show you one last thing, and then we'll check out some comments, and then we'll head on out of here. All right. So here's what I said back in 2022 when she was being confirmed. I said, asking a Supreme Court judicial nominee if they can define a woman is as absurd a question as current social media trends redefining woman. The latter makes the former unfortunately relevant. KBJ's response provided no justice to the absurdity of either. Right. So I'm pointing out, like, this question was not a good question to ask in the first place, but her answer didn't help the situation whatsoever. Probably that would have been simpler to say. But so for me, I look back and I am looking and trying to figure out, I don't need to know it in detail, just need to have an idea. Like, oh, you're a strict constructionist. Okay, I can go and look up what that means and see if I generally would agree with you. Oh, you're an originalist. You're a living constitutionalist. You're a progressive originalist. Any one of those things. You should probably have some idea, especially if you're involving yourselves in politics on a regular basis. And I saw a lot of people that talk about politics. They've been talking about politics for years and mention a single thing that I said tonight. Nothing. So we're keeping ourselves uninformed, and that's a shame. So if you're upset with KBJ and how she's ruled, in a way, blame yourself, boss. All right, let's check out let's check out the live chat. Let's see what you guys got going on over there. So put on some music here. All right. Keith says, what a pleasant surprise. It's cool. I like surprising people. Although I'm going to try to be consistent. I did just really need to end up this month with, the final hours. I was like almost there, and I was like, no, can't lose, must win. So, but pleased to have you, by the way. Let's see. It's good to see you, Time Surfing Alien. Love all you guys. Let's see. My VA lady, she says, DLB keeping me on my toes. Streams at 5:30 a.m. and 8 p.m. Yeah, I'm a little crazy sometimes. You would think that I would like slow down, like, oh man, you're 47. No, I think I'm in some ways getting worse, because now I'm all like, I'm like planning it like a day ahead of time. I'm like, I could just actually lose sleep here. I could do this. I could do this. I could work this out. Whereas it used to be, what I would actually do is I would just wing it, right? Like, oh, I got a few minutes. I'll just push this off, whatever. Right now I'm planning it. So I might be worse. I don't know. But yeah, I try to keep all you guys on your toes. And hopefully I am bringing you an episode a conversation here that you find meaningful, feel free to go down into the show notes and check out the links. I'll make sure that they're all in there. Go ahead, fact check me, come back, criticize me and say, dude, you got it totally wrong. Let me know how I did, because I want to improve. So, and I want to make sure that tomorrow's show is better than today's, than yesterday's, so on and so forth. So that's my goal. All right, folks, I think I've successfully hit my numbers for the night. So I'm going to do something, kind of scary. I'm going to end the show, and then I'm going to go and see whether or not I made it. Or maybe I should just keep on here, and see. Maybe I could just I could flip it over into Rumble Premium. I think I'll do that just to amuse myself. So I'll see you guys. Oh, let me get my, let me get, I'm being so stupid right now. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you are there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. You can also become part of the community by heading over to libertydad.locals.com. Remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.